It's strange how certain moments cling to the mind, bright, vivid, unforgettable. But stranger still are the ones that lurk in the shadows of memory, refusing to fade. You see, I once painted a picture, a simple street scene, sunlight playing on an old Cornish village. Harmless enough. And yet, whenever I glance at it, something sinister whispers from the brushstrokes. A shadow that wasn't there before. A presence I can't explain. That picture has haunted me for 5 years, and with good reason. Joyce Lempriére paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass as she spoke. Her voice had an uneasy quality, as though she were reliving something she'd rather forget. The others, gathered around the table, leaned in, drawn to the unspoken tension in her words. It happened in Rathole, she continued, a little Cornish fishing village, too picturesque for its own good. That kind of beauty isn't always in a sentence, the kind that hides things beneath the surface. Rathole was a place straight out of a travel poster, quaint, cobbled streets, thatched roofs, a sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and adventure. But it was also a place that had been worn down by its own charm, drowning in its own attempt to be a postcard-perfect vision of Old England. Bobbed-haired girls in smocks painted delicate mottos on parchment, while visitors swarmed the tea houses for overpriced scones and history that had been sanitized for tourists. I had gone there to sketch, Joyce went on, to capture the light, the movement, the essence of the place. But I captured something else, something that still lingers in my mind, no matter how much I try to forget. She had found the perfect spot outside the Polharworth Arms, an old inn steeped in history, its timbered facade standing defiantly against time. Local legend claimed it was the only building left standing when the Spaniards attacked in the 1500s. Not attacked, Raymond West interrupted with a groan. Historically inaccurate, Joyce. They landed guns and fired them. Well, whatever they did, the result was the same, Joyce retorted. Buildings fell, but this one remained. She had just settled down with her sketchpad, eager to capture the charm of the inn, when a car began its slow, twisting descent down the steep, narrow street. It moved cautiously, navigating the sharp turns like a snake winding its way toward its prey. Joyce sighed in irritation. It would, of course, stop right in front of her, blocking her perfect view. A man and a woman stepped out. She was dressed in mauve, a soft lavender shade that somehow seemed both elegant and too deliberate, as though she had dressed with a specific effect in mind. Joyce barely glanced at them. Tourists were a common sight here. The man soon re-emerged, leaving the woman inside, as he drove the car farther down to the quay. He strolled back up toward the inn, hands in his pockets, lost in thought. Joyce had just begun sketching again when another car came twisting down the street, kicking up dust as it came to a halt a little farther down. This time, a woman emerged, a striking contrast to the first. She wore a vibrant chintz dress, red and white splashed with bold poinsettias. Her wide-brimmed straw hat, Cuban in style, was as bright a red as her lips. There was an energy to her, something electric and unrestrained. The man who had, moments ago, been strolling back toward the inn froze, and then, with a voice laced with disbelief, he called out, "Carol, in the name of all that is wonderful, fancy meeting you here." Something in the air shifted. The bright, cheerful afternoon, the postcard-perfect village, the play of light on the cobbled street suddenly. It all seemed artificial, like a painted backdrop concealing something darker behind it. Joyce couldn't explain why, but at that moment, she felt it, that creeping unease, that whisper of something wrong. She didn't know then that she had just witnessed the first movement in a silent, deadly performance. A story painted not in colors, but in blood. As I sat there sketching beneath the golden Cornish sun, I had no idea I was about to witness something that would stay with me for years. It began as a moment of coincidence, one of those chance encounters that seem harmless on the surface, yet beneath the pleasantries, something unsettling stirs. "Carol, in the name of all that is wonderful, fancy meeting you in this out-of-the-way spot. I haven't seen you for years. Hello, there's Marjorie, wife, you know. You must come and meet her." His voice carried through the warm afternoon air, tinged with an enthusiasm that felt a little too forced. as though he had spoken before thinking. I looked up from my canvas just in time to see him, Dennis, as I would soon learn, striding forward, his entire posture shifting with the arrival of this new woman, Carol. There was something about her, something bold and striking, like a woman who always left an impression whether she meant to or not. Her chin was dusted in an unnatural white powder, and her lips flamed red against the pale paint of her skin. She looked like a figure who belonged in the dazzling lights of a city rather than this quaint Cornish village. But it wasn't Carol I was watching, it was Marjorie. She had just stepped out of the inn, her presence unremarkable in comparison. Dowdy, proper, the kind of woman who might fade into the background if you weren't paying attention. And yet, I found myself wondering, would she really be so pleased to meet this woman from her husband's past? Did she already sense something amiss? It was none of my business, of course, just one of those odd glimpses of life one occasionally stumbles upon, snippets of drama unfolding like a play, revealing just enough to ignite curiosity. I kept my eyes on them as they talked, their voices carrying in fragments down the sleepy street. The conversation was light, casual, about bathing, of all things. Dennis, it seemed, had plans for an outing. He wanted to take a boat and row along the coast to see a famous cave about a mile away. Carol, however, showed no enthusiasm for boats. She suggested they split up. She would walk along the cliffs and meet them there, seeing the cave from above, while Dennis and Marjorie rowed to it from the water. There was something almost calculated in the way she proposed it, as if she wanted the separation for a reason beyond simple preference. As I listened, an odd feeling crept over me, a sense of disquiet that had no rational cause. Perhaps it was just the way Denny had reacted to seeing Carol, or the quiet tension in Marjorie's stance, but I felt, inexplicably, that something was about to happen. The talk of swimming made me suddenly long for a dip in the sea myself. The morning had been sweltering, and I wasn't making much progress with my work. I decided that the afternoon light would be far better for sketching anyway, so I packed up my things and made my way to a small, secluded beach I had discovered earlier in my stay. It was in the opposite direction from the cave, untouched by the crowds, a little hidden cove where the water shimmered like liquid sapphire under the sun. The swim was glorious, cool, refreshing, washing away the heat and the strange unease I had felt earlier. I lunched there, alone, with nothing but the sound of the waves for company, a simple meal of tinned tongue and 2 ripe tomatoes, and for a time I forgot all about the curious trio I had left behind. When I finally returned to my sketching spot in the afternoon, the village had changed. Rathole, usually buzzing with the quiet hum of life, had sunk into an eerie stillness. It was the sort of silence that settles when something is wrong, when people have retreated indoors, whispers curling through the narrow streets. I had been right about the light. It was perfect now, casting long, dramatic shadows that danced on the cobbled pavement. But even as I set my sketchpad on my lap and lifted my pencil, the unease returned. The village wasn't just quiet, it was waiting. And something told me that whatever had happened while I was gone was far worse than I could have imagined. The Polharwyth Arms stood at the heart of my sketch, its weathered facade bathed in the soft, golden light of the afternoon. A single ray of sunlight slanted down at an odd angle, striking the ground in front of it with an almost unnatural brilliance. There was something peculiar about the way it illuminated the cobbled pavement, as if it were drawing attention to a secret long buried beneath those stones. I noticed 2 bathing suits hanging from the balcony railing, one a striking scarlet, the other a deep navy blue, swaying gently in the breeze. It was a small but significant detail. The bathing party had returned safely, or so it seemed. I bent over my sketch, focused on correcting a minor flaw, smoothing out a misaligned shadow. It couldn't have been more than a minute or 2, but when I lifted my head again, there was a man leaning against one of the ancient pillars of the Polharwyth Arms. He hadn't been there before. His sudden appearance was almost ghostly, as if he had materialized out of thin air. Dressed in the rough, salt-stained garb of a fisherman, he might have blended into the scene except for his beard. It was long, thick, and jet black, framing his face with an intensity that sent a slight chill through me. If I had ever envisioned a wicked Spanish sea captain from an old telemerciless, brooding, With a past soaked in blood, this man would have been the perfect model. His presence demanded attention, exuding an air of quiet menace, as if he carried the weight of something far older and darker than mere local gossip. I worked feverishly, desperate to capture him before he moved, but he stood there, eerily still, his body pressed against the pillar as though he intended to prop up the entire building for eternity. He was watching me, or perhaps watching something beyond me, something only he could see. Then, just as I finished the last few strokes, he shifted and, to my surprise, walked straight toward me. When he spoke, his voice was smooth, almost too smooth. There was a strange quality to it, like the whisper of waves on jagged rocks, a melody both soothing and menacing. "Rat Hole," he said, drawing out the name with an unsettling familiarity, "is a very interesting place." I nodded, muttering something in agreement, hoping it would be enough to move him along. But it wasn't. He had decided to speak, and I had no choice but to listen. With a storyteller's relish, he launched into the village's grim history. I had heard fragments before, but never like this, never with such vivid, almost hypnotic detail. He spoke of the day the Spaniards came, of how they rained destruction upon the village, tearing through it like a storm. The Pulhar with arms had stood then, just as it stood now, a silent witness to the carnage. And it was here, upon this very threshold, that the final act of brutality had unfolded. The landlord of the inn, the last man left standing, had met his fate at the hands of a Spanish captain. Run through with a gleaming blade, his body crumpling onto the very stones before me. The fisherman leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but the weight of his words pressed heavily against the warm afternoon air. "His blood spurted out onto the pavement," he murmured, "and for 100 years, no one could wash out the stain." A shiver ran down my spine despite the heat. I glanced instinctively at the ground, at the very spot where the light had been so strangely focused before. Was it my imagination, or did the cobblestones there appear darker, as though they had absorbed something long ago, something that refused to be erased? The atmosphere had shifted. The warm, sleepy afternoon had taken on a different texture, thick with unseen weight. The man's voice, though polite and almost reverent, held an undercurrent of something else, something that lurked beneath the surface. Obsequious yet unsettling, gentle yet laced with cruelty, as though he were relishing my discomfort. For the first time I understood the Inquisition not as dry history, but as terror incarnate. I understood the horror of those who had stood before ruthless men with eyes that burned with quiet violence. And I understood, with bone-deep certainty, that some places held on to their pasts with a grip that never loosened. I swallowed, trying to shake the unease. It was just a story, after all. Just a tale spun by an old fisherman who enjoyed the sound of his own voice. And yet, somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted, and for a brief moment, I could have sworn I smelled salt and blood. The brush moved almost on its own, sweeping across the canvas with effortless precision. I was painting better than I ever had before, lost in the hypnotic pull of the fisherman's story. His words wove themselves into my thoughts, latching onto my imagination like creeping vines, dragging me into the past with each syllable. My mind was consumed, enthralled, and that was when it happened. A chill prickled the back of my neck as I stepped back to admire my work. Something was off. My breath hitched as I realized what my hand had done. There, on the white pavement in front of the Pulhar with arms, where the sunlight had been so curiously bright, I had painted something that wasn't there. Blood. Dark red droplets, splattered across the cobblestones, stark against the pale ground. The realization was like ice in my veins. My grip tightened on the brush, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. Had I really painted that? I hadn't intended to. And yet, there it was, clear as day. Shaken, I turned my head slowly toward the inn. My mind must have been playing tricks on me, twisting the fisherman's grim tale into something tangible, something real. That had to be it. I had imagined it just a slip of the hand, an unconscious thought finding its way onto the canvas. But then my pulse stuttered, because what my brush had painted, my eyes now saw. There, in the exact same spot where the Spaniard's blade had once struck down the innkeeper, The white stones bore fresh, glistening stains of red. The blood wasn't on my canvas alone. It was there. Right there. My breath shuddered out of me. I shut my eyes tightly, willing myself to be rational. This is absurd. There's nothing there. You're imagining things. I opened them again slowly, cautiously bracing for relief. But the bloodstains were still there. A cold dread settled in my stomach. My hands trembled as I clutched my brushes, my mind scrambling for an explanation that refused to come. My voice was tight, uneasy, as I cut through the fisherman's endless stream of words. "Tell me," I asked, trying to steady myself. "My eyesight isn't very good. Are those bloodstains on the pavement over there?" The old sailor turned toward me, his dark eyes twinkling with condescending amusement. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No bloodstains these days, lady," he said, his tone almost patronizing. "What I'm telling you about happened nearly 500 years ago." I swallowed hard. No bloodstains these days, but my gaze remained locked on the ground, on those unmistakable gleaming spots. I wanted to point, to show him, but deep down I already knew. He wouldn't see what I was seeing. The invisible weight pressing against my chest became unbearable. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this street, from those stains, from whatever unseen force had pulled them from history into the present. With shaking hands, I fumbled to pack my things, my movements hurried and clumsy. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. The young man from earlier, the one who had arrived with his wife that morning, stepped out of the inn, glancing up and down the empty street, his expression troubled. His gaze drifted toward the balcony, where his wife had emerged to collect their drying bathing clothes. She moved as if nothing was wrong, oblivious to his unease. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he made a sudden decision. He walked toward his car, but veered at the last second, crossing the street straight toward the fisherman. "Tell me, my man," he asked urgently. "You haven't seen the lady who came in the second car, have you?" The fisherman scratched his beard thoughtfully, then shook his head. "Lady in the dress with flowers all over it? No, sir, I haven't seen her. She went along the cliffs toward the cave this morning." The young man's expression darkened, his shoulders tensed. Something was wrong. And in that moment, standing on the sunlit street with invisible blood at my feet, I felt a deep, gnawing certainty settle inside me. She wasn't coming back. The young man's voice held a note of growing concern as he glanced up towards the towering cliffs. I know," he said, his forehead creased with worry. "We all bathed there together, and then she left us to walk home, but I haven't seen her since. It can't have taken her this long. The cliffs around here, they're not dangerous, are they?" His voice wavered slightly, betraying his unease. The fisherman, a man of weathered skin and sharp eyes, gave a slow nod. "That depends, sir, on the way you go," he said in his rich Cornish accent. "The best way is to take a man who knows the place with you." His tone was casual, but there was an underlying suggestion in his words, an almost deliberate pause, as if expecting the young man to ask for his guidance. The young man, however, was too preoccupied with his thoughts to pick up on it. He abruptly turned away, cutting off the fisherman's attempt to continue, and strode quickly back toward the inn. Looking up at the wooden balcony where his wife was gathering their belongings, he called out, "I say, Marjorie, Carol hasn't come back yet. Odd, isn't it?" I couldn't hear Marjorie's reply, but her husband continued speaking, his voice more impatient now. "Well, we can't wait any longer. We have to push on to Penrithor. Are you ready? I'll turn the car around." Without further hesitation, he climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and slowly maneuvered the car around before disappearing down the narrow street with Marjorie by his side. All the while, I stood there, trying to steady my nerves, forcing myself to accept that what I had seen was nothing more than a trick of my imagination. But was it? The thought nagged at me as I took hesitant steps toward the inn, my pulse quickening. I bent down and ran my fingers over the sunlit pavement, where only moments ago I was certain I had seen something impossible, something sinister. But of course, there was nothing there, no dark stains, no trace of blood. My mind must have been playing tricks on me. and yet the absence of any evidence made the experience even more unsettling. It was then that I noticed the fisherman watching me, his dark eyes filled with something unreadable. A shiver ran down my spine as he spoke, his voice both soft and knowing. "You thought you saw bloodstains here, eh, lady?" I swallowed hard and nodded. He let out a thoughtful hum before speaking again. "That is very curious indeed. We have a saying in Rat Hole, lady, a superstition, if you will. If anyone sees those bloodstains—" He paused, drawing out the moment. I could barely breathe as I whispered, "Well?" The fisherman leaned in slightly, his voice now nothing more than a murmur. "They do say, lady, that if anyone sees those bloodstains, there will be a death within 24 hours. A chill settled deep in my bones. My throat went dry. I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, to laugh off his words as nothing more than local folklore. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I just knew that something terrible had already happened. I shook my head firmly. "No thanks," I said decisively, turning sharply on my heel. There was something about that fisherman's words, his knowing tone, that unsettled me. I needed to get away. Without another glance back, I walked briskly up the narrow, winding street towards the cottage where I was lodging. My heart was still pounding from the eerie conversation, my mind filled with uneasy thoughts about bloodstains that weren't really there, were they? Just as I neared the cottage, I stopped in my tracks. In the distance, along the rugged cliff path, I saw her. Carol, the missing woman. She was moving quickly, almost too quickly, her figure distinct against the gray, craggy rocks behind her. There was something jarring about the scyther dress. A violent shade of red billowed as she hurried, making her look like a poisonous scarlet flower blooming against the harsh, desolate landscape. Even her hat was the color of blood. I shivered involuntarily. Blood on the brain, I muttered to myself, forcing out a hollow laugh. First the illusion of bloodstains, now this. My nerves were getting the better of me. I watched as she disappeared from sight, her hurried steps taking her down toward the village. Moments later, I heard the unmistakable roar of a car engine. I turned just in time to see Carol's vehicle pull away. Was she heading to Penrithar to meet the others? But no, her car veered left, taking the road in the opposite direction. I stood there watching, waiting until I could no longer see the car as it crawled up the hill and disappeared beyond the bend. A strange, inexplicable relief washed over me, as though a weight had lifted. Rat Hole, with its sleepy charm and slow-moving life, seemed normal again. The village exhaled, the tension dissipating into the salty breeze. "If that's all," Raymond West said with an amused smirk as Joyce finished her story, "then I think I can provide my verdict: immediate indigestion. Spots before the eyes after meals." Joyce narrowed her eyes at him. "It isn't all," she said firmly. "You have to hear the sequel." Raymond rolled his eyes, but gestured for her to continue. Joyce took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking again. 2 days later, I was reading the paper when a headline caught my eye. "Sea bathing fatality." My heart nearly stopped when I read the details. The article reported that a woman named Mrs. Dacre, wife of Captain Dennis Dacre, had drowned at Landirkovia Place, not too far along the coast from Rat Hole. Raymond's smirk faded slightly. Joyce continued, her voice steady but weighted. According to the report, Captain Dacre and his wife had been staying at a hotel near Landir Cove. That morning, they had planned to go swimming together. But as they were preparing, a sharp, cold wind had picked up. Captain Dacre had decided it was too chilly, and instead went off to the golf links with a few others. Mrs. Dacre, however, had insisted the weather didn't bother her. She left alone, walking down to the cove for a swim. Joyce hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. But she never came back. The room fell silent. Her husband grew concerned when she failed to return. He gathered a few people from the hotel and went down to the beach to look for her. When they arrived, they found her clothes folded neatly beside a rock just as she had left them before going into the water. But there was no sign of her. The sea had swallowed her whole. For days there was nothing. No clues, no sightings. Until nearly a week later, when her body finally washed ashore several miles down the coast. And here's the most chilling part. Joyce's voice dropped to a whisper. When they examined her, they found a deep, terrible wound on her head, a blow that had happened before she drowned. A slow, uneasy hush settled over the room. Raymond finally broke the silence, but his voice was quieter now, the jest gone from his tone. So, what are you saying, Joyce? That it wasn't an accident? Joyce met his gaze. I don't know what I'm saying, she admitted, but I do know this. 2 days before it happened, I saw bloodstains on the pavement outside the pulhar with arms. And the fisherman told me that when the bloodstains appear, death follows within 24 hours. Raymond exhaled slowly. Joyce folded her hands in her lap. I saw those stains, I know I did, and now someone is dead. No one spoke after that. The theory was simple yet chilling. She must have dived into the sea and struck her head against a jagged rock. A tragic accident, they called it. But as I pieced everything together, an eerie realization settled over me. Her death had occurred precisely 24 hours after I had seen the bloodstains on the pavement. Coincidence? Or something far more sinister? Sir Henry scoffed at the idea, waving his hand dismissively. This isn't a puzzle to be solved, it's a ghost story. Miss Lempriére, I dare say you might be a medium. His voice carried amusement, but beneath it there was an undeniable unease. Mr. Petherick, ever the logical man, cleared his throat, his usual habit when considering something carefully. One point does stand out to me, he said, his voice measured. That blow on the head. We must not be so quick to dismiss the possibility of foul play, but unfortunately we have no real data to support such a theory. Miss Lempriére's vision, or whatever you might call it, is certainly intriguing, but there is no tangible evidence. Indigestion and coincidence, Raymond interjected, shaking his head. And anyway, how can we even be certain that the woman Joyce saw and this Mrs. Dacre are the same person? Not to mention, this so-called curse would surely only apply to those who actually live in Rathole. Sir Henry leaned forward, his expression sharpening. That seafaring man, the one who spoke of bloodstains, there's something about him. Something I don't like. His voice dropped slightly. I can't shake the feeling that he is somehow connected to all of this. Joyce turned toward Dr. Pender, hoping for some insight, but the elderly clergyman merely smiled kindly. It is a fascinating tale, my dear, he admitted, but I must agree with Sir Henry and Mr. Petherick. There is very little concrete information to draw a firm conclusion. With that, all eyes fell on Miss Marple. She sat comfortably in her chair, her expression unreadable, a knowing smile playing at her lips. I must say, Joyce dear, she began, I do think you are being just a little unfair. Joyce blinked. Unfair? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear. You see, it is quite different for me. We women, after all, pay far more attention to the details of clothing than men do. And that, I believe, is the key to the entire mystery. She paused for a moment, then gave a small sigh. What a wicked woman. And an even more wicked man. Joyce's breath caught. Aunt Jane, Miss Marple, I believe, you know the truth. Miss Marple merely smiled, her twinkling eyes betraying nothing. Well, dear, she said softly, perhaps I do. The woman in scarlet. Sitting there with my knitting, it was all so clear to me, clearer, perhaps, than it had been for Joyce, caught up in the eerie atmosphere of the moment. It's much easier for me, dear, I said gently. You're an artist, and artists are so susceptible to atmosphere, aren't they? But when you sit quietly and just look at the facts, things become quite obvious. The bloodstains weren't supernatural at all. They had dripped from the bathing dress hanging above. A red bathing dress, of course, so the criminals never realized it was blood-stained. Poor thing. Poor young thing. Sir Henry frowned. Excuse me, Miss Marple, but I must admit I'm entirely in the dark here. You and Miss Lempriére seem to understand what you're talking about, but we men are still utterly lost. Joyce leaned forward, her voice lower now, drawing us in. Let me tell you the end of the story, she said. It happened a year later. I was at a little seaside resort on the East Coast, sketching as I often did. The sun was warm, the sea calm, and for a while, Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. But then, I had that strange feeling, the one where something seems to be happening all over again, like a moment repeating itself from the past. There were two people in front of me, a man and a woman, chatting animatedly. Then another woman approached them, dressed in a striking scarlet poinsettia chintz dress. I caught my breath. That color, it was the same. Just like before. "Carol, by all that's wonderful," the man exclaimed. "Fancy meeting you after all these years. You don't know my wife, do you?" "Joan, this is an old friend of mine, Miss Harding." The name meant nothing to me, but the man it did. I recognized him instantly. Dennis. The same Dennis I had seen at Rat Hole. The same man whose wife had drowned mysteriously. The only difference was the wife. This one was called Joan instead of Marjorie. But she was the same type, young, timid, dressed plainly. The kind of woman who wouldn't stand out, who would be easy to overlook. For a moment, I thought I was going mad. It was too much of a coincidence. The three of them were discussing going for a swim, just as before. My heart pounded. I knew I had no real proof, only a terrible, gut-wrenching certainty, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I gathered my things and walked no ranto, the nearest police station. I expected them to laugh at me, to think I was crazy, raving about bloodstains and premonitions from a year ago. But they didn't. When I arrived, I found that Scotland Yard was already there. A detective had come down specifically about this man. It turned out that Dennis Dacker wasn't his real name. He had changed identities multiple times, moving from town to town. And everywhere he went, the pattern was the same. He got close to young women, particularly quiet, trusting ones. And then, one way or another, they died. The police had been watching him for some time, but they had never been able to prove anything. He was clever, careful. But this time, I had seen the pattern before it could repeat itself. Joyce exhaled shakily, as if even now the weight of what she had discovered still clung to her. "I don't know what happened next," she said. "Whether they caught him, whether they saved Joan before it was too late. But I do know one thing: if I hadn't been there that day, if I hadn't seen them, if I hadn't gone to the police, then by the next morning, Joan might have been gone too, just like the others." For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was utterly silent. Then Sir Henry cleared his throat. "My dear Miss Lempriére," he said gravely, "I take back my words. That was no ghost story." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said. "It was something far more terrifying. A story of wickedness hiding in plain sight." And in the quiet of the drawing room, with the fire crackling softly and the shadows deepening, we all sat with the same thought pressing down on us. How many times had such wickedness gone unnoticed? How many more had fallen victim before someone finally saw the truth? A story of wickedness hiding in plain sight. The truth, when finally unraveled, was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This was no mere accident, no tragic miscalculation of the sea's fury. It was a carefully orchestrated crime, repeated with chilling precision. The man known as Dennis Dacker was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Davis, a man with a history of false identities, slipping through towns unnoticed, leaving behind a trail of victims, and he had not worked alone. The woman called Carol, striking in her scarlet clothes, was not just an acquaintance or a lover. She was his real wife. Together they had perfected a monstrous scheme, a routine so flawlessly executed that it had fooled the world for years. Their targets were always the same: quiet, inconspicuous young women, usually without close family or many friends. Women who, once gone, would not raise immediate alarm. Davis would charm them, win their trust, and in due time marry them. And once they were his wife, he would insure their lives for a substantial sum of money. That was when the real plan began. He would take his new bride to a peaceful seaside town, a place where no one knew them well, where they could blend in effortlessly. And then, when the moment was right, Carol would appear, her role already prepared, her part in the performance rehearsed to perfection. The three of them would go bathing together: Davis, his unsuspecting wife, and Carol, the accomplice who would later take her place. It was all done methodically, almost ritualistically. Once they were in the water, the new wife would be drowned or struck fatally before being left to the mercy of the sea, and then the transformation would take place. Carol, waiting for the moment, would emerge from the water, wrap herself in the victim's clothes, and walk back to shore, as though nothing had happened. No one would think twice about it. They had seen her go in. They had seen her come out. The disguise was simple but effective. Afterward, Davis and Carol would leave the town, asking around for the woman they had just killed, pretending to be concerned when they found no trace of her. And when they reached a safe distance, Carol would change back into her own flamboyant dress, wipe away whatever meekness she had adopted, and slip back into her real self. Meanwhile, the current would do the rest. The body of the murdered wife would wash up along the coast, at a different beach, where it would appear she had tragically drowned on her own. That was how they had done it, over and over again, in different towns, under different names, and that was how they had nearly gotten away with it. But this time something had gone wrong. When they killed poor Marjorie, something neither of them had noticed had happened. Blood had spurted onto Carol's bathing suit. It had blended seamlessly into the red fabric, unnoticed in the moment. But when they hung the suit over the balcony to dry, the blood had dripped onto the pavement below. It was a tiny mistake, but sometimes the smallest details unravel the greatest of crimes. Joyce shuddered at the memory, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I can still see it," she whispered. "The bloodstains on the ground, the red dress swaying in the wind. It makes me sick to think about it." Sir Henry, his expression grim, leaned back in his chair. "Now I remember," he said. "Davis. That was his real name. One of the most cunning criminals I ever came across. It had completely slipped my mind that he once went by the name Dacre. They were incredibly clever, the two of them. The sheer audacity of it, that's what made it so difficult to catch them. Even when we suspected Davis, he always had an ironclad alibi. The change of identity was seamless. No one ever questioned it." Raymond turned to Miss Marple, studying her curiously. "Aunt Jane," he said, shaking his head, "how do you do it? You've lived such a quiet, peaceful life, yet nothing seems to surprise you." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly as she knitted. "I always find one thing very like another in this world," she said. "There was Mrs. Green, you know. She buried 5 children, Avery, one of them insured. Naturally, one began to get suspicious." She sighed and shook her head, her voice carrying a quiet but weighty wisdom. "There is a great deal of wickedness in village life. I only hope you dear young people will never have to realize just how very wicked the world truly is." And in the hush that followed, as the fire crackled gently and the shadows stretched across the room, no one could quite shake the feeling that the world was, indeed, far darker than they had ever thought possible.